Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about adaptation. And to do that, I'm going to use this document, which is available in Mediación Virtual. This is a summary of the chapter, a chapter from Dudley Andrews' book, Concepts in Film Theory. Let's start by saying that adaptation is the matching of a cinematic science system to prior achievement in some other system. It's the appropriation of meaning from a prior text. This comes from interpretation theory. Simply what it means is adaptation takes from a previous text and appropriates it in form or in meaning or in content in order to create a new sign that would be cinematic with a different language. So it's going from one artistic sign to another. The previous text or the original text, we call it the source. It's an artistic sign that has a given shape and value, if not a finished meaning, and it becomes a signified or referent of the new sign. So a new sign is born. Depending on the level of fidelity, it's going to be very close to the original or not. Adaptation implies also the cultural status of the model, because nobody's going to adapt something that doesn't have a certain status or that is not considered good or successful in its own right. That's why we get film adaptations of books that are very famous, or even video games that are very popular, and those are the ones that are selected for adaptation in film. There's always a prior whole or conception that is adapted in representation of film, and it's never an immediate response to reality itself, because film adaptation is always mediated by a source, that it's the one that is it's a representation of an original reality. So there's always a certain, several steps that modify or refract the original source and turn it into something new. All representation in films are interpretations of a previous reality. Some even announce themselves as versions of some standard whole. That's why we get at the beginning of certain films, this is inspired by, or it's based on, or it's an adaptation of. Sometimes even in the title, you watch Francis Ford Coppola's film, Bram Stoker's Dracula. So from the very title, you know that this is an adaptation of an original novel written by Bram Stoker. So some film adaptations are very clear as to what their source is and what they're doing. There's also an explication of a text that occurs only after prior understanding of it. That is, it's not possible to adapt a literary text unless you understand it first. And this is very helpful for you as you work on your film projects, because whatever literary text you choose to adapt, you got to understand it very well first. And finally, there's these film adaptations are always derived and inspired by previous texts in an attempt to reconstruct those texts. Now, there are modes of adaptation. One of them is borrowing. It's the most frequent one, is the one that we usually see in films, in which the artist employs more or less extensively the material, idea, or form of an earlier, generally successful text. That means that it's not necessarily a copy of the original text. It's in some way a reworking or a reconstruction of something about that original source. It may be the main idea, it may be the main characters and their story, it may be their form or whatever. And it's always done in the hope of winning success and popularity by borrowing from the original success and popularity of the original text. So people go and watch a movie, Harry Potter movies, because they're based on Harry Potter books that were very successful and very popular. And the filmmakers are hoping that the same success and popularity of the original source is transposed into their new sign, their new version of it. This is done in borrowing all the time. Certain aspects are emphasized more than others. That's why we never get the exact same story or the exact same characters or the exact same setting. They're always transformations, because some aspects are emphasized and some other aspects are de-emphasized. Now, what we do as literary critics is that we analyzed how the original source is being used in the new sign, in the film adaptation, in the film. We don't care so much about the fidelity. We don't care about how close the film is to the original source. So we move away from this idea that, oh, I liked the book better or I like the original source better because it had more events, because it were had more characters, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the type of analysis we do. It's simply trying to see how the original text is transformed into a new text. It's more about the fertility of the original text, that is, how much material it provides for the filmmaker to work on and to create a new version of it, than it is about how close the final product is to the original source. Now, the second mode of adaptation is intersecting, and it's in a way opposite to borrowing, because this one is very close to the original. It's intended to preserve the uniqueness, the originality of the original text. So it's pretty much left unassimilated in adaptation. We get like the exact same words or the exact same events in the film text as you find them in the original text. So it's not an adaptation so much as it is a refraction or an experience of the original. It's simply putting the original text on the screen so that people can have access to the original text without thinking so much about differences or about the originality of the film because it offers a new version of it. It's not a new version of it. It's the same, but it's modulated by cinema. It's using cinematic language instead of written language. But in the end, it presents the distinctiveness and the otherness of the original text. What analysts do is that we study the specificity of the original within the specificity of the cinema. So in this case, it's opposite, because we're focusing on how close it is to the original and how the cinematic language makes that transition possible without changing it so much. The original lives in the cinema in this case. Now, talking more about modes of adaptation, there are two concepts that are very important, and I think I've already been introducing some of those concepts. Those are fidelity it's the concept of fidelity and the concept of transformation. If we put them together, fidelity of transformation. So it is assumed that adaptation is the reproduction of cinema of something essential about an original text. So it's not, if we think about the fidelity of transformation, we're thinking more about what is that something essential about the original text that is being transposed into cinema. So film is trying to measure up to a literary work, and the audience is expected to make such a comparison. So it's impossible for us not to compare the original text and the film version of it that results from adaptation. So what is fidelity of adaptation? We're paying attention to the letter or to the spirit of the original. If we pay attention to the letter, that means that we're paying attention to the characters, the setting, the basic narrational aspects, and the literary text easily becomes a scenario. So if there's fidelity in the letter, that means that the characters, the setting, the narration, all of those aspects remain pretty much the same in the film, okay? So there's a fidelity in the letter, that is in the text itself. Now, the fidelity of adaptation, when we pay attention to the spirit of the original, there may be many differences in the characters, in the setting, in the narration, but we're going to find that the original tone, the original values, the imagery, the rhythm, the most abstract or the most difficult to grasp concepts or ideas about the original text are the ones that are being preserved in the film text. So how does the tone, how do the tone, the values, the imagery, or the rhythm of the original text are transformed into the cinematic language? And what are the stylistic equivalents that are used in the movie to reproduce those aspects that are more difficult to grasp? This is the spirit. So we say that there's a fidelity of adaptation because the spirit, not the letter, the spirit of the original text is preserved and maintained from one source to the other. Now, what happens either way is that there is a replacement of verbal signifiers by cinematic signifiers. So the verbal signifiers are the words, the phrases, the sentences that we read in the novel or the play or the story that is being adapted. But in the film, those signifiers are replaced by cinematic signifiers. Camera movements, camera shapes, the mise-en-scène, the colors, the lighting, the sound, the music, all of those that we've already discussed and we've already learned about and practiced. So when we pay attention to fidelity of transformation, we're trying to figure out if it's the letter or the spirit that is being preserved, and how does the movement occurs, how does the movement occur between verbal signifiers and cinematic signifiers. Now, there's a concept of translation. Film works from perception towards signification, from external facts to interior motivations and consequences. This is something that I mentioned on day one this semester when we talked about the word and the image. When we read something, usually we read the word or the phrase, we have to imagine it in our heads, and then we react emotionally to it. But with film, because it uses images, it's different, because we see the image, it's an exterior motivation, and we react emotionally to it, and then we can process it and try to find signification in those images. So this is pretty much what happens when we analyze film. It goes from perception, what we perceived on the screen, and then we give meaning to that. It's external to us, and then it motivates us innerly, right? And there are consequences, our emotional consequences to that. So literary fiction works oppositely. It begins with signs, with the words, to develop perceptions, and it treats human motivation and values to throw them out onto the external world. That's what I already explained, right? When we read words, we develop those perceptions in time, and then we react to them and throw them back into the external world. So how is true translation possible? I mean, how can we really translate from something that is internal to something that is external, or something that is external to something that is internal? Because the signifier systems belong to different systems. You cannot really translate a word into an image. I mean, you can translate words into words. You can translate English words into Spanish words, or Spanish words into Portuguese words. But how does translation happen from one signifying system that's literary to another signifying system that is cinematic? There are different matters of expression. So one of the ideas around this concept, it's a philosophical idea, is that there's actually a global signifier of the original separable from its text. That means the story tells us, a novel tells a story, for example, that is actually already translating an idea, a global signified, an imaginary signifying, and it's translating it into words. And what film does, according to this theory, is that it doesn't necessarily go to the original text, although it's inspiration, but it's taking from this original signified and translating it into film. So you read a short story by Poe, for example, The Fall of the House of Usher. It tells you a story about this brother and sister who live in a secluded mansion, and the sister is dying, et cetera, et cetera. So what a film adaptation of that would do is to be inspired by the original text, by Poe's short story, but instead of translating the words, it's actually translating the signified of the story, thinking of it in terms of existing somewhere outside the story. That's where Poe took the idea from, and that's where the filmmaker who's adapting the story is also taking the idea from. So the translation doesn't happen between the story and the film. It's the translations happen, both of them, from an original signifier, an imaginary one. That's where Poe took it from, and that's where the filmmaker took it from too. And that's the real translation that's going on. How do we compare Poe's translation of this reality and the filmmaker's translation of the same reality? We put into one by one, one next to one, the signifying systems. Literary signifying systems, words, phrases, punctuation, et cetera, cinematic matters of expression, what I already mentioned, right? The movement of the camera, the sound, music, mise-en-scène, et cetera, all the matters of expression that pertain cinema, okay? And of course, we do all of that by the use of semiotics. Now, some conclusions. Adaptation, then, it's the matching of equivalents. It's searching two systems of communication for elements of equivalent position within those two systems. Those two systems of communication would be literature and film, and some elements of both systems of communication become equivalent, right, in one way or another. And that's how adaptation takes place. Adaptation is possible, and it's never perfect. That's why it's wrong. That's my personal position, actually. It's wrong to watch a film that is based on a literary text expecting to find the literary text in that film. You're never going to find it. The study of adaptation includes the study of both art forms. We have to understand the literary text and then understand the film version of it. In each of both systems, literary and cinematic, there are different codes, perceptual, referential, symbolic codes. The same codes may reappear in more than one system. Sometimes they are equivalent and matchable, sometimes they're not. Imagery functions equivalently in film and literature, and this is one of the easiest ways to approach literary film adaptation of literature, is that there's always imagery. Literature employs imagery. Film employs imagery. So that's like a one-to-one connection that it's very difficult to miss. Narrativity is the most solid media link between novel and cinema. Narrative codes are potentially comparable. Yes, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story has a structure. We already talked about this when we talked about narrative analysis of film. Well, the same narrative approach that we can give to a literary text is the same approach that we can give to a film that is based on it. So that's another way of approaching adaptation, right? One is using imagery, another one is paying attention to narrativity. And finally, the analysis of adaptation includes the achievement of the equivalent narrative units in the different semiotic systems. So there are the original narration and how it is achieved in the different semiotic units, literary and cinematic. So just recapping, when we approach adaptation, we do several things. First, we determine if it's borrowing or if it's intersecting. And also we pay attention to imagery in both texts. We pay attention to narrative structure in both texts. And most importantly, we analyze how the original text produces meaning and how the new text, the film, produces meaning. What are the connections between the two? How is it that the language of literature is translated into the language of film? What elements of the original film are emphasized, in the original text are emphasized in the adapted text? And what elements from the original literary text are de-emphasized or left out in the film version of it? So this is some ways in which you should be approaching adaptation, and hopefully you'll be able to work on this for your final essay. So we'll talk more about this when we meet again next week, and I hope this helps. Remember, there's a comparative analysis exercise for you to do in pairs and Simulación Virtual. This is about Blue Jasmine, Streetcar Named Desire, and Kazan's film version of A Streetcar Named Desire. So it's a three-way comparative analysis and some questions. Okay, good luck. Bye-bye.